Destined for Glory. This podcast is a Bible study on Romans 8:28 through 30. It requires no knowledge of Accordance Bible software, but a bit of Greek might be helpful. Romans 28 through 30 is an important passage, but one in which Paul's larger message is often lost. That's because it's also one of the passages about which Calvinists and Wesleyans, or Arminians, disagree. Today we'll take a look at the passage's literary context and its structure, and try to discern the apostle's original point and purpose. Here is an outline of Romans from Outline of Bible Books. I've opened two instances of this accordance tool and placed them side by side in separate zones. This makes it possible for us to see the outline of the whole book at once. Our target verse is here. As we can see, it is subsection C, Victory over the Flesh through Life in the Spirit, of section 5, God's righteousness imparted through sanctification. As we will see, it is not just victory over the temptations of the flesh, but also victory over persecution and threats to the physical body. Let's zoom in on this chapter and look at its individual paragraphs. One of the difficulties we have in assessing literary context is trying to hold the whole book, or even the whole section, in mind. Even though I have a 17-inch computer display, I had to shrink the font size to what you see here to get all of chapter 8 on a single screen. Our target paragraph is here, but there are 6 other paragraphs in this chapter. Now, the inductive Bible study method says that we need to write a single-sentence summary of each paragraph. Here are mine. First, the law of the Spirit of life has set us free from the old law of flesh, sin, and death. Second, the Spirit of life reigns in us, our sure guarantee of bodily resurrection. Third, we are co-heirs with Christ. If we suffer with him, we will also be glorified with him. Then, all of creation suffers with us, waiting patiently for our resurrection. Our target verse summary is, the Spirit intercedes for us that God will work all these things for our good, followed by, no one can condemn us, nor any trial separate us from God's love. And finally, we are more than conquerors through Christ. I then put each of my one-sentence summaries into my user notes. Now that we've analyzed our passage's literary context, it's time to look at its structure in more detail. The 5th paragraph splits nicely into 2 parts. A, the Spirit knows how to intercede for us, and B, we know that God works everything for our good. I inserted a heavy vertical line in the passage to remind me of this division. And as I worked through the passage, I also used various other highlighting symbols. They helped me keep track of repeated words, important concepts, and sequences. Our interest, of course, is in the second half of this paragraph, the concept that God works everything for our good. Let's zoom in even further, this time in Greek, and using the diagram of the Greek New Testament. Again, I've added 2 instances of a tool to this workspace. This time it's the Greek diagram. I unlinked the second pane and scrolled it so we can see the entire diagram of the passage. The main thought of this verse is introduced by the phrase, we know. The main thought itself is that God works everything together for good. Now, I've taken the liberty of turning this passive statement into an active one throughout this podcast, and supplying God as the subject. Paul, like many other New Testament authors, showed sensitivity to the Jewish conventions of his day. That meant using the passive voice and an implied subject when describing something that God did. However, that's not the way we generally speak in contemporary English. We prefer stated subjects, not implicit ones, and the active voice to the passive one. So all things work together for good, in good English, becomes God works all things together for good. This proposition is followed by 3 sections, a limitation, an explanation, and a description of the process of actualization. Let's look more closely at all 3 sections. The limitation is that God only works things for good for a certain group of people. Paul described these people with 2 phrases, those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. The two phrases are parallel, as we can see in the sentence diagram, two different descriptions of the same exact group. Now it's interesting that the first phrase, those who love God, is the one stressed by Wesleyans, who emphasize human responsibility. Calvinists, on the other hand, stress God's actions and the necessity of being called by God, the second phrase. While Paul himself was certainly neither Calvinist nor Wesleyan, as neither theologian was born until long after he finished writing his letters, it is interesting that he used these phrases as if they described two sides of the same coin. In his explanation, Paul referred to this same group, tying the two sections together by using the same relative pronoun. Here he said that God foreknew them, a Wesleyan emphasis, and predestined them, a Calvinist emphasis. Now, the apostle could have saved us all a lot of controversy by specifying whether God's predestination was based on his foreknowledge, or his foreknowledge based on his predestination. Unfortunately, he did not specify which came first. Instead, he wrote using two verbs that are both aorist active indicatives, and if there is any tense in Greek that is difficult to assign in time or sequence, it's the aorist. Why didn't he speak more specifically here? Probably because it wasn't related to his main argument. His main argument is the purpose for which God has done all these things. It is to transform God's people, these lovers of God called ones, these foreknown predestined ones, into the image of Jesus Christ. Paul wanted to assure the Romans that what was happening around them was part of God's plan, his process. Here, he did not concern himself with how his readers came to be part of God's people, but in assuring them that God was fully capable of completing the process he had begun. That process is described in the third section, actualization. It expands it into many different steps, beginning with predestination and ending with glorification, that point at which God's people become conformed to his Son's image and his many brethren. In between the start and end of the process, Paul details being called and being justified. But he didn't linger long at either. Why? Because the Romans had already passed those stages, at least those to whom Paul wrote this letter. They were in the process of being glorified, and they were shocked at the struggles and persecution they faced. It's worth mentioning at this point that Romans is not just a theological treatise. It is a theological treatise with a pastoral heart. Paul sought to set forth a pragmatic theology, one that would sustain his readers in the midst of harsh trials. To what, then, are we predestined? Paul says that we're predestined to suffer, for this is an essential part of our glorification, just as it was for our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Being conformed to the image of God's Son, verse 29, means accepting the injustice of the beating, the humiliation, and the cross. When we zoom back out to consider the larger context, as we have here, it reinforces this interpretation. Verse 17 also ties suffering with glorification. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided that we suffer with him in order that we may also be glorified with him. It fits the following paragraph too, where Paul says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that's to be revealed in us." Having then laid out our predestined path in our target verse, Paul then asks, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to the slaughter." He then responds to his own question with a resounding, "No, in all these things we are more than conquerors," assuring us that not even death can separate us from Christ. While modern interpretation focuses on the relationship between divine knowledge and predestination as it relates to salvation, Paul's interest in Romans 8:28-30 lay elsewhere. His point was that God works suffering for our benefit, just as he does everything else. It is the predestined path to our glorification, just as it was for our Savior. Paul's purpose was to encourage his readers. Suffering is part of every Christian's path. Endure it. Rejoice in it. We are destined for glory. I trust you've enjoyed today's Bible study. In it, we use the inductive method of Bible study to establish our passage's literary context, then analyze the diagrams of the Greek New Testament to uncover its detailed structure. We also put a priority on recovering Paul's original point and purpose in this passage, setting aside, for the moment at least, our interest in systematic theology. This has been Dr. J for Accordance Bible Software. Thank you for watching this episode of Lighting the Lamp.